All right. Welcome, everybody that's tuning in. We're YWAM Denmark, and we have a guest with us today, Stephen Schallert, all the way from, for us, almost the other side of the world, South Africa, Mozambique. And today we're going to talk about compassion and justice and other really good stuff. And the reason why we're talking about today is because we are running a DTS starting in September called Hands and Feet, and it's all about becoming the hands and feet of Jesus and talking about what is that like and how do we need to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world and how does that connect. And so tonight I'm here with Steve just to talk about compassion and what does that look like in today's age as well. So I'm really excited just to have a conversation with a great man of God. I think I'll just introduce himself quickly and then we'll just jump into the meat of it. I'm really excited. Steve's one of the teachers in our DTS, and he's just an amazing man to listen to. He's insanely entertaining as well. It's just a lot of fun to see him. Just take you on a journey and to get you to think and to get you to think differently. I think that's really something he's amazing at. So I'm really excited for tonight, and we'll just jump into it. So Steve, I would say jump into it. Just give us the meat of it, and tell us what it's all about.
Beautiful. Well, hey everybody, and thank you YWAM Denmark for letting me come hang out with you guys. It's a gift, even in this magical medium of technology, to be able to hang out and have a conversation. So yeah, thanks. My name's Steve Schallert, for those of you guys who don't know, or pretty much everybody, I assume. And I come to you guys on behalf of YWAM Mozambique here in Cape Town, South Africa, where it's currently really boiling hot. And so all of y'all in the northern hemisphere can just deal with that. And so I come on behalf of our community here in South Africa, and Edwin Felix, our community leader, and the Khoi people whose land we currently stand upon, and say thanks for letting me be with you guys. So yeah, we're here to talk tonight, I guess, about justice and compassion. And so, Wimjan, I don't know how you want to start, or if there's any way you want me to kind of jump into it, but you have any thoughts?
I do. One of them is that I forgot to say my name. My name's Wimjan. I'm originally from Holland, and I live in Copenhagen. So for the people that do not know me, Steve, I would just like to for you to start off with a little bit of like, hey, how did you get into this whole justice compassion thing? How did it start? Of course, it's a longer story, and I think people should show up the DTS and hear the rest of that. Just give us a little snippet of hey, how did that story start for you, and why do you care, and why does God care in that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so that is a long story. So, I mean, my family, my wife, our kids, we live here in Cape Town, South Africa right now. I've been working with YWAM down here for quite a while. And so my journey into thinking about and wrestling with the nature of what is justice and what is compassion and what does it have to do with this story of Jesus and this Jesus journey that we're trying to emulate and trying to live within. It goes back quite a way. So, I mean, I can give you a quick overview. I grew up in Germany, actually, and in high school I moved to America. And when we landed in America at interesting times, I had a hard time kind of settling. I have an older brother who kind of wiggled his way through the process and eventually found kind of a group of friends. And I have a younger sister who's a few years younger than me who just kind of bounced. But I kind of hit America and kind of crashed into a story. So if there's any other third culture kids out there, you can relate to some of that kind of dislocation of a sense of groundedness. And I ended up in high school and walking through just this story of trying to figure out what it means to, be a person. And I also grew up a missions kid. Grew up in this story. And for any of you guys who maybe grew up in the church, maybe you have already, or maybe you haven't yet. But most of us who grew up in church worlds, we eventually hit this thing that I call the wall, where we kind of slam into this moment or to the season where we have to kind of figure out this faith that we've inherited, how much that, it's just the water that we swim in, right? When we grow up in kind of church worlds. And so there's this transition phase where it doesn't just become this thing you've inherited, but you start asking the question of what does it actually mean to you? And so I crashed into that wall during a time in America where these airplanes smashed into these buildings. And, this impression and this imprint of what happened during 9/11 in America when I was coming out of high school and going into university, and at the same time asking every question you could possibly ask about what does it mean to follow Jesus, and do I even want to? And was also, watching at the same time this kind of 2-3 year period where the drum beats of war were starting to kind of pound everywhere. And for one of the first times, for me at least, the differentiation of the story of Jesus and the pursuit of who Jesus was really coming into like a conflict with everything I saw happening around me, where the story of the church by and large was going right along with the story of violence and the invocation for revenge and everything that was happening at the time. And for most of the church world around me, there wasn't a big discrepancy between this idea that this war that was starting to, erupt in Iraq was not discongruent with following Jesus. And for me, I was having this deep-seated, like, what does it mean to follow Jesus in a world of violence? And in a world that's getting ready to, again, explode in violence. And to make a long story short, I had a run-in with a handful of folks who became my mentors, who were peace activists at the time, who were embodying a way of following Jesus that kind of set my imagination on fire. And basically, I looked at these people who became my friends, who were busy getting arrested for all the right reasons, busy trying to follow Jesus in a world of violence by preaching a message of peace, by embodying these ridiculous ideas, but that looked a lot like the love of God in a world of chaos. And I looked at all of their lives and looked at many of these folks who were a generation or two older than me at the time, and I just said, man, if that's following Jesus, I mean, I could do that. I could follow a Jesus who would look into the darkness and say, "Let there be light." And so that's kind of how I stumbled into this story. How I stumbled into YWAM is a whole nother story. But basically, for the last 15 years or so, myself and my wife have been on this trajectory of trying to follow Jesus in a world of violence, and trying to ask the question of how do you be faithful to the story of Jesus in a world of violence, and in a world of injustice, and in a world of chaos and war and all the things that we're stumbling through. And I think that in these days right now, coming out of the year that we've all just had, I think the temperature has risen, and it's been a real year, at least for me. I assume for many of y'all too, of just it's been a revelation, a revalio. It's been a unveiling. I think that. A lot of stuff that's been invisible has become really visible in this past year. And so maybe a lot of y'all like me, 15, 20 years ago, were just starting to really wrestle with some big questions. I think this last year has caused a lot of us to start to wrestle with some big questions.
That's really good.
Sure.
I think for me, that was, I think I was a little bit later maybe with my questions. I grew up obviously in a very safe Dutch Reform background. So it took me to go all the way to Nepal to find a bunch of people that were so in love with Jesus that they would hike the mountains just to find one person they give a Bible to see that. But I think that and maybe that's what I want you to pinpoint a bit. It's like we talk a lot about justice in the world. We talk a lot about mercy, and for me, what is interesting that when I met Jesus, or when we started talking about who he really was, his way of compassion and mercy was so radically different than the one that I had seen. Maybe even if we look at church history, has been understood. Maybe that's the question I'm saying. Like, Steve, what makes Jesus so different when he taught, like in the story of mercy and compassion, than maybe all the other truths that we try to find?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think if you want to get to the heart of that, you have to kind of go. You have to go back further, because one of the things we need to recognize about Jesus is that Jesus lives within a tradition. And Jesus is in our language, the fulfillment, the perfect revelation of that, fullness. And so we want to understand what Jesus is doing, especially as it relates to any conversation around justice or mercy or imagination or compassion. You got to back up. And I would advocate that we back up straight to the beginning, like to the point where we say in the beginning. So if you open page 1 of your Bible, there's this story, this poem that unfolds, and trust me, this all leads us to Jesus. But it goes basically like this: it says, in the beginning, the earth, the world, this thing that we all live on, is formless and void, and darkness, chaos. The waters cover the deep. Right. So the first thing, I'll just pause right there and just say this: as we open the beginning of the poem of creation, there's really nothing that indicates that this chaos, this water, this darkness is somehow evil. It just is. And in fact, this chaos, this darkness, this water becomes the raw material that God uses to create beauty out of. So I'll just pause here as well and just say to everybody who's sitting on this Insta Live time, that if you're in a season of chaos, and I think many of us are, and if we're kind of feeling our way through some of that craziness, it's worthy to pause in the first couple sentences of this Genesis poem and recognize that this chaos we hold can also be the raw material that God might want to use to create beauty out of. So let's just say that first of all. But the story keeps unpacking, right? Where light cuts the darkness. And this poem of creation, of the first creation story in Genesis 1, erupts day after day after day. And at the end of each day, there's this word, this admonishment of the nature of creation itself, where God continuously looks at creation and says, creation is good. It is good. It is good. It is good. And on the seventh day, it is very good, right? In the Hebrew, the word there is tov. It is tov, 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 tov. And on day 7 is very tov. And that word's really important, especially as we begin a conversation on justice, mercy, compassion, human relations, the way that we exist within the world, and what it means to follow Jesus in a new way of being human in the world. And see, most of us, when we think of things that are good, or things that we wish were good, we tend to think of we most of us have inherited a Greek worldview, especially those of us in the West. And by that, when we think of things of good, we tend to think of something that has moral value or an individual value. So we can say that, women, you're a good guy, or this is a good computer, or that's a good guitar, right? And things carry goodness in themselves. But in the Hebraic imagination, in the imagination of tovness, this word in creation, tovness has nothing to do with the individual nature of goodness, right? Tovness, goodness in the biblical poem of creation is always about the goodness between things. the goodness that rests between. That's why in the poem there's this endless couplets, right? There's the night and the day, there's the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And what is good is the goodness that rests between the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, the goodness between the night and the day. It's the goodness that rests between you and me. And that's what makes something good within the biblical framework, within the framework of this creation story. And so right here, right at the very beginning of the story, before we ever get to Moses and the Torah, before we get to Jubilee and the prophets, before Isaiah shows up to tell us that we need to loose the bonds of injustice and break the yoke of iniquity, before Hosea starts to admonish that God desires mercy and not sacrifices, and long before Jesus shows up to embody that mercy, a mercy which ends sacrifices and judges a world held in slavery to death. Right there on the first page of these books we call the Bible is a worldview that is predicated on interdependence, mutual blessing, and it demands that we all see and recognize the intrinsic necessity of each other. You follow me? The intrinsic need of our interdependent existence, and that what God calls good is not just you and me, but it is the nature of our relationships together that creates something good. And so if that's true, and that's a foundational story for those of us who want to live within the tradition that Jesus embodies, because Jesus erupts into the world embodying tovness, goodness, helping define for us what it means to be a human that lives this tovness in relationality between people and all of creation, right? And works to counterbalance and fight against all of that which would seek to destroy it. Death and all of its death-dealing friends, for that matter. So right in the midst of that space is an invitation for us to recognize that to follow Jesus, to enter into that story, is to pursue a life that is dedicated to tovness, to goodness, between things, within the reality of our relationships between one another and between all of creation. And so it redefines what is good. And this is really, I think, where, as you ask the question, how do we, how is Jesus different? Well, Jesus is different in that Jesus is the embodiment of the essence of who and what God is, which is love, but also living within a tradition that is advocating that the world essentially is tov and meant to be tov. And all that seeks to destroy the tovness, the goodness between things, lives in opposition to the nature of reality itself, right? So that's the beauty of who and what Jesus embodies for us. Is this new way of being human that says, wait a minute, mercy triumphs over judgment. Wait a minute, there's a new way of being human. Wait a minute, death and violence and greed and oppression are not the end of the story. You follow me? And so it beckons a lot of difficult questions if we begin to say that what is good is actually what rests between us, right? So, I mean, many of us are having this conversation on our telephones or on whatever. And so the question beckons us to begin to ask, so what makes this thing good? Like, why is this thing good, right? Like most of us would just say, well, it's good if it works, right? Or you're good if, if I could get something from you, or whatever it is, right? And so what's good about this, if we begin to place it into a biblical framework or into a Jesus-y framework, is actually we have to begin to consider every relationship that created this, that brought this into this room in Cape Town, South Africa. And so the question on, is this good, begins with, okay, is there a good relationship between the soil and those who mined it? Is there a good relationship between the way workers were paid as they did their work to create the reality that is this computer now? Is the system of economics that has enabled it to move across the world and end up where it is inherently good? And are those relationships beautiful, right, righteous? And so it complexifies our world and begins to reimagine the world, not from what we can gain from it, but whether or not it is or isn't good. And that's essentially a biblical vision of justice.
Come on. I just want to say for people that are watching, if you have any questions about what Steve is saying, feel free to write them in chat, and maybe I'll bring one of them up. And we have time for that. So just a little side note. It's really good, Steve.
Shot, man.
And I think for me, the first time I sort of heard you talk about this, yeah, I just never heard somebody put it in those words before or give me that perspective. And I think it's a beautiful conversation to have. I think what is interesting for me is that we get to a place where we talk a lot about, especially also I think in our generation, about okay, what's the meaning of life, and what we do, does it actually matter? And then we come to that place either, if this is the way, then everything that we do matters, right? Like everything holds value, every person, every transaction, every part. But it also brings us responsibility. I think that's a major key for me. Like if we are connected to each other in the world and everything that binds together, like the idea of shalom and interconnectedness, then that brings us responsibility for us. But we can't just pretend that we're not here together.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it fundamentally shifts the way, right? Like, so here's the thing, right? There are countless stories that are trying to define our relationships. And frankly, if Jesus isn't helping us define the story of our relationships, or if we don't have a biblical vision of our relationships, or whatever it might be, right? Something else is going to define the nature of what it means to be alive. Or we can think about our bodies, right? Even just the existence of bodies. Something's going to define what this is for, right? Like most of our Western economic systems are going to define that this is for productivity. That's it, right? It's for production. It's for what it can be used for, right? And so we have relationships predicated on usury, on the capacity to contribute to a society's economic floor, whatever it might be. Right. And frankly, again, like the minute we begin to rethink the narrative and live within the story that says, no, tovness is the foundation. Goodness is the foundation. An original blessing is the foundation. The nature that who you are and what your body is matters. It's valued in and of itself because of this. You can think about it this way too. Like when we think about the nature of how God saves, right? We're saved in our bodies, right? Like I'm saved in my body. When that salvation came to me, it came in a body, right? I'm not saved from my body. I'm saved in it. And the incarnation of God in Jesus, that moment where God became a person, right? Where God embodied God's self in whatever, like the magical like language we try to put to that nonsense. That's a crazy idea. This idea that God took on flesh, became body, right? All the poems and energy we try to put around trying to talk about that. When God is embodied in the person of Jesus, it redeems the world, but it also redeems the very nature of embodiness, of the fact that our bodies matter, that to be in a body is beautiful, that tovness is what we're made for, right? And the same is true when we think about how God saves across, not just that God saves us in our bodies, but that God also saves us in the world. God doesn't save us from the world. God loves the world and sent his son to save the world. And as long as we're telling ourselves stories that are primarily about means of removing ourselves or our bodies or existence from the actualized relationships of creation, justice becomes kind of irrelevant to the Christian story. But if we affirm with the biblical tradition a world of interdependence and tovness, and if we affirm the nature of incarnation itself, right, and the redemption of embodiness itself, then the litmus test for the love of God becomes the love of neighbor. Then the way that we interrelate with one another, you're right, is not just important, but it's the essence of faith. It's the practice that we embody and are called to. Amen.
What do you think was one of the keys for you to sort of unlock or to make you see some of these things? Does that make sense? Like, I think you talk about unveiling a lot, which is a great term to use. But yeah, you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's really this come down to the question of who is Jesus, and right, this invitation to say that I'm captivated by the person of Jesus. I think the person of Jesus is so incredibly beautiful. Who Jesus is and the way that Jesus chose to live. And I think if we really just get down to to ask the question that like Tolstoy asked, which is what if Jesus is serious? What if the invitation of Jesus's way of being human is the way that Jesus desires for us to live? Tolstoy had this incredible transition story. I don't know if some of you guys know who Leo Tolstoy was. He's this great historical Russian author. He was a great great author, great person to engage with. But he had this moment in his life where he was reading through the Sermon on the Mount, dedicated to the Christian story for quite a while. And as he was reading through, the archetype of Jesus's sermon, like that like pinnacle like teaching, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, reading through the Beatitudes, reading through all that you've heard it said, but I tell you now, all these invocations of Jesus. He had this question that lodged itself into Tolstoy's brain, where he just began to ask the question over and over again: what if Jesus is serious? What if these teachings, ways of being, what if the way that Jesus is living his life is actually the way that we should follow Jesus? That might have a profound impact on the way that we see one another, see ourselves, and actually live our lives together. And so for Tolstoy, that sent him down a 40-year rabbit trail that ended in a really interesting way. But I think Tolstoy's question is it for me. It's that kind of perplexing, continuing big question of what does it mean to follow Jesus? And by follow, I just mean follow, like do what Jesus did. Begin to ask what it means to animate our lives around that story today with one another in a world of violence, in a world of COVID, of death, of everything that's swirling around us, a beauty of celebration in the midst of that. What does it mean for us to be the hands and feet of Jesus today? To live the nature of God in the world now, to pursue tovness with one another. But I do think you're right that, again, the stories, people are storied. We live within stories. And I think this process of unveiling, or what we, in the biblical tradition just call repentance, right? To learn to think differently, metanoia in the Greek, right? To learn to think differently, open our eyes, our imaginations. That's a lifelong process of letting go, of opening ourselves to new experiences, of choosing relationships with people who are not like us, of getting good mentors, of saying a lot of I'm sorry's, of learning how to fail well, of stepping into messes that we don't know how to fix, of making big decisions and then deciding that they were really romantic and done for all the wrong reasons, and stumbling our way through the dark in this process of trying to figure out how do we follow Jesus together. So it's a lot of learning, unlearning, learning how to see, right? And I think I see that in Jesus a lot as he advocates all the time, if y'all got eyes to see, open them. If you have ears to hear, let's hear them, because there's a lot of things, there's a lot of stories I tell myself, and there's a lot of stories I don't want to hear.
Yeah, that's so good. But I think one of the things you talked about has been really key for me, and is the question, like, do I dare to get close enough? And I think Jesus is really great at, and well, the person of Jesus is literally God getting close, right? But I think
Yeah.
that's been such a key for me. And last year we went to um, Brazil, and we visited the brothels and the prisons, and we met these people that we would all say are the outsiders, right? And the question was, do I dare to step into close enough to actually meet the person instead of what I perceive them to be, or who I think that they are or not. And I think that has been such a key for me of like, and part of the reason why I love my experiences of the last year is that I've come so close to people that I never knew or probably never thought I'd meet, because I stepped out of my own safe bubble, right? And all of a sudden, you realize there's so much more, or yeah, so many more people out there to love, to impact, to learn from as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I remember one of the guys. Um, his most impactful story, I think, of outreach was something that a lady said to him in prison. Right? Like, she's like, "Yeah, the society thinks of us as trash. Trash can be recycled." So he's standing there, behind the iron bars, and I think that's part of the beauty for me of being part of DTS and just daring to step out of my own safety and to engage with, following Jesus. And the big question, was he serious?
Yeah, well.
So
Yeah, and like if you want to push that even deeper, like I think about this a lot sometimes, where like the cross is many things. If you think about the cross of Jesus, this kind of pinnacle moment of Jesus's life, and then ultimately his death, right? That story. The cross is many, many things. It's salvation, it's redemption, it's all those things, but I also often think that the cross is also geography. It's the question of where is God, and where is God in the midst of the cross? He's on the cross, right? He's in the space of suffering. And the same is true today. I think of like on WhatsApp. You can have that like you can send your pin of where are you. That whole thing, like send your flag thingy. I don't know how this technology stuff works. I'm too old. But I know you can send your little flaggy flag, and then people know who you are. I kind of think like the cross is like God's flaggy flag. It's like where God is. And so God's geography is with the poor. It's in the crucified. Once and for all. It's what in certain theological circles that I flow in, we talk about God's preferential opinion for the poor, the nature that's where God dwells, or just to actually affirm what Jesus calls blessed on the first beatitude, when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God," meaning the kingdom of God is theirs first. They already have it. They own the keys. And so to push it even further than just saying, "Man, who can I love?" The invitation to follow Jesus, to actually pick up our cross and follow Jesus doesn't save us from having to follow him. Jesus saves us that we might follow him. The invitation to step into these paradoxical relationships, like you're talking about, is that actually I must step into those for my salvation, to find my way out of the dark, to find the nature of where God is, because God dwells there. In that situation, where is God? On which side of the prison wall do you think he's in? And yeah, we can say he's everywhere, but he's there first. He's in that space. And so, frankly, we step in, it's kind of like a reverse evangelism. I mean, we're stepping into these relationships because I know I need salvation. And salvation is where God is, and God is there. And so that's to push that even deeper than just to say, man, how do I become the hands and feet of Jesus? But also to say, how do I touch the hands and feet of Jesus, which are in the places where the crucified are, because that's where God is first and foremost.
That's so good. Do you have any finishing thoughts? Anything you just want to get off your chest, or things you want?
I have a million finishing thoughts, a million things to get off the chest, but no, I don't know, friends. I mean, we're here, I know it's called compassion, when I think about compassion, compassion, by the way, doesn't mean to just care about something. Compassion, like, it literally means to ache from the bowels. That's what compassion means, to literally become nauseated with the nature of injustice, or the lack of tovness, or the to ache from the bowels. I think again of another beatitude from Jesus where he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for righteousness, who hunger and thirst. I think a lot of us have read the Beatitudes so many times that they kind of lost their punch. But to hunger and thirst for something, that's a powerful image. To hunger for something. Justice isn't something we just want or hope for. It's something that if we're in the Jesus story, should literally starve us. It should keep us awake at night. It's as we're literally aching for the kingdom of God to come crashing the earth. It's one of the reasons by the way, I think fasting can be such an important, valuable Christian practice. Because when we fast, we begin to ache in our bodies a little bit. We get to ache in our bodies alongside the 2 billion bodies that are aching every single day. From hunger. But compassion, to ache from the bowels, right? To hunger and thirst, that's a powerful image. I think a lot of us want justice, think about goodness and rightness of relationships. But I think it's another thing entirely to be kept awake at night because we're literally aching for the kingdom of God to come crashing to earth, to live in that compassion with passion life, frankly, friends, if you're going to follow the Jesus way, at some point the pain of others is going to become our pain. Co-suffering is the very nature of who and what Jesus is, right? It's what we see on the cross most fully, is this co-suffering, outpouring of love on behalf of the other, even to the enemy, right? I really appreciate the old gospel saying that the gospel comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable. I know that's rung true for my life, that the closer I get to Jesus, the deeper I step into that story, the more it's simultaneously is so incredibly comforting to all the parts of my person who are so disturbed. In the year that we've had now, I mean, Jesus is it's one of the only things I feel like I got left half the time. And at the same time, the gospel is very disturbing to me. It really rattles my cages. It asks much of me. It unravels the ways in which my life cooperate with death and all of its friends, the way that my life and existence perpetuates suffering within the world. And so the gospel is simultaneously comforting me and disturbing me on every single twist and turn. And frankly, that's a beautiful table to set for people. It's not always the most when I think of the early churches in inviting people to come follow Jesus, they seem to make it really difficult. Like it was like a really hard thing to do. If you wanted to join the church, it was very difficult. yeah, so maybe stepping into y'all's beautiful journey that you're about to step into again at the end of this year with Hands and Feet DTS. The table is set simultaneously to find a tremendous comfort in this person named Jesus, and likely to be fairly disturbed by that same comforting person, who, you know, will rattle our cages and invite us into a journey of toughness, of finding a new way to be human. But it's beautiful, and it's the only story I feel compelled to live within any longer.
I think I love for us to just there's a one sentence that I remember a lot from your Wicca teaching, and that is, "What is does not have to be."
Yeah,
And I just love for you to to talk about that for a bit before we close. I don't see any questions. If people have them, shoot them now, because we're slowly getting to the end. But I'm holding on to Steve as long as I can.
sure.
Um, no, I just love for you to dive into that a bit, and just to go, because I think that's also part of the wrestle that we have, or the conversation we've had, or the conversation we've had for generation, and that is the renewal of our imagination, right?
Devil.
That we're called to radical hope. That even though the whole world is talking about, you know, it's only getting darker, we are called to be the light.
That's right. Yeah. Oh man. I mean, we could talk about this forever, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, out of everything that is possible in the world today, what I hope for the church is that the church gets a bigger sense of imagination. I think more than anything else, more than good missional planning, more than good strategies, more than anything else, what we need is a deeper sense of imagination. We need more imagination, frankly, because before I'm in South Africa, before apartheid could fall, there had to be a people alive who could imagine the world without it. Before the Berlin Wall could come down, there had to be a people alive who could imagine a world without it. Before we, I don't know, like, what do we need to imagine the world without today, or with today, right? We need a deeper sense of what's possible, a deeper sense of imagination. The scripts that have been written for us, that have left us hanging, and primarily left, the poor among us hanging, doesn't have to be. If Christ has risen from the dead, frankly, we're getting close to Easter here, right? To this time where we celebrate the fact that Christ died, descended into death, and came out, right? Um, and the heartbeat of the Christian narrative is that if Christ has risen from the dead, then death has died. Then death is on its door, on its deathbed. Then death doesn't have the last word. So what can we possibly be afraid of anymore? And so, if Christ has risen from the dead, then what is doesn't have to be. Then the nature of death and violence and poverty and brokenness, we have to recognize again that, long before in the Genesis story we get to the fall, long before we get to the corruption of creation, long before we get to death and all of his friends coming piling into the reality of the world. Before that is tovness. Before that is a blessing. And I think our gospel, by the way, would be more beautifully preached if we started with an original blessing instead of an original sin, but that's another conversation. But that tovness is all around us if we have ears to hear and eyes to see it, And again, it relates a lot to what we were talking about just a minute ago of how the gospel disturbs and comforts at the same time. And the gospel also opens us to embrace the reality of suffering around us. Like we talk about proximity, you're talking about how we become hands and feet, how we step into the veil of darkness, how we navigate ourselves. We pick up our cross and follow Jesus into the darkness. And that's difficult because we have basic human tendencies to recoil from suffering. I avoid as much suffering in my own person. I'm really good at hiding it in all kinds of crazy pockets. I got some over here and over here. I'm really good at like doing ninja moves to hide my own suffering, and it's fairly natural for me to like even though I'm in South Africa here, where I can't, you can't take 2 steps without, crashing into reality. But I'm still really good at figuring out ways to get across town and whatever, and just avoid the reality of suffering in the cities, in the world that we live in. And yet Jesus invites us constantly. I mean, if we look through the stories of Jesus, he's just constantly centering, affirming, drawing people who suffer, who have been cast aside, systematically oppressed, pushed to the margins, to the center of reality. Frankly, Jesus is also that. Jesus is the one just centering that. Jesus is that. Jesus is, this man born in Nazareth, the place that nothing good can come from, into a poor working class family in the midst of tremendous violence. Jesus is that, right? And so the Jesus story, draws us closely to suffering. And when we confront suffering inside of ourselves and others, when we look at the nature of crucifixion, I don't know about y'all, but I despair pretty quickly. That capacity to despair after the year we've had, it's really fresh for me. It's singing a lot of lament songs these days. I'm trying to hold it up. The beautiful thing about faithing together in community is that some days when I need you to believe it for me. But the nature, the paradox of the Christian faith is that we step into proximity with suffering inside of ourselves and the world, and then the invitation is that of resurrection and to believe in the nature of hope, to have a foolish hope, a radical hope, a resurrecting hope, to practice resurrection in the darkness, right? To step into that life of embodying salt, light, city on the hill kind of existence together in communities, right? And that's, by the way, why we need community and friends to do it. But it should perpetuate a deep hope inside of us. And that paradox is where we live, right? We live in that space of tremendous suffering and proximity to suffering and tremendous hope, because we know that death doesn't have the last word. And that's the great balancing act of faith in the Christian tradition. That's that great teeter-totter of our existence. And that's why simultaneously we need songs of praise and songs of love. We need to know how to throw a party and a funeral. We need to know how to walk together in communities of mutual dependence that are running after toughness in our relationships, because without each other, we're not going to make it. It's why Christianity is not a solo sport, but it's always a team sport. It's something we should do together. And I think this year has kind of showed that to a lot of us as well. I think a lot of us have been scrapping after communities and spaces to belong. So we're sitting in isolation in all kinds of spaces, hey? So I don't know, that's a splattering of thoughts. But yeah, I think what is doesn't have to be, is, in my mind at least, it's the heart of the Christian message. It's the affirmation of resurrection. It's the reality that as I look around the world, I'm trying to live in a posture what I would call holy jet lag, right? To be in the moment, but not of the moment. To sit in, the present age of darkness, but my imagination is being forged and formed on a future that I know is coming. It's the reality that the church's vocation is to live today what the world shall be ultimately, right? As Jesus is the first fruit of a new creation, our vocation as a people, as a community of faith, as a DTS, as a church, as whatever, is to embody Jesus' new way of being human as a foretaste to what the world shall ultimately be. That's what we're called to do. That's what life in communities of Jesus followers are meant to be, right? To perform holy jet lag for the world. Shaman.
So good.
Yo, it is good.
Totally. Very totally. I just want to round up a bit, give you guys that are watching some information. Me and Steve love working with DTSs, and this is conversations that we have around both the teaching but also the dinner table as we wrestle and talk about, was Jesus actually serious? DTS is 3 months of lectures where guys like Steve come and they both bring comfort and unrest in our souls and our beings. And then we just go on a journey together, figuring out what it would look like for the kingdom to fully come to earth. So if you're interested, if you're just you're free to comment and write. We would love to respond to you guys. But if you're interested, we have a website, YWAM Denmark, Hands and Feet DTS. Find more information, contact us. We'd love to talk to you. If you're around in Copenhagen, come and hang out with us. If you're in Jutland, come and hang out with the guys at Schallert. And if you're around in Musenberg, then as soon as are you guys open? Actually, I don't even know.
Yeah, South Africa's fairly open right now. There's some life kicking around down here.
So you go hang out with Steve. He's amazing. Yeah, shoot us questions. We just love having conversations like this. This is the first one. We might do more in the future. Yeah, stay in touch. Steve, for now, this is awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, man. Let me just affirm this as well. Like friends on the internet, I've been around the block to a lot of communities, to a lot of spaces, working with a lot of different leaders and people across the world. And if you've been thinking about jumping into a Jesus story for a while, or you've been interested in just forming community, especially after the year we've just had, and you're looking for a place that I would advocate is good and beautiful and full of people who are genuinely kind, which frankly these days is kind of the litmus for me. Is, are people kind? So if you're looking for kind people to spend the season with, growing and learning, I would push you towards hanging out with those friends of mine up there in YWAM Copenhagen for the Hands and Feet School. It's awesome, beautiful community of people. You should do it.
Thank you so much.
Shop.
All right, that was it. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.
Shop.
This is